In the 5th century, the ancestral marshlands of the Jutland Peninsula were actively disappearing under the North Sea. Jutland, the landmass that makes up modern-day Denmark and northern Germany, was facing a catastrophic environmental crisis. The people living there, the Angles and Saxons, are often remembered by history as invading warriors. But the ancestors of the Tunnicliffe lineage were actually environmental refugees, fleeing a collapsing ecosystem. With coastal flooding swallowing their farms, these tribes faced a brutal binary choice: stay and drown in the rising tides, or pack up everything and attempt a mass migration across the North Sea. That crossing meant navigating what they called the Whale Road. The Whale Road is the vast, violent stretch of open ocean, standing between their sinking home and the fertile, elevated cliffs of Britain to the west. But crossing hundreds of miles of open water in the 400 CE came with a massive technical limitation. They had absolutely no magnetic compasses to guide them. So how exactly does an entire displaced civilization pilot wooden boats across a hostile ocean to a specific destination without any way to reliably point north? The survival of these refugees relied on specific maritime engineering, the clinker-built oak hull. Clinker-built refers to a method of boat building where the edges of the hull planks overlap each other, making the vessel highly flexible and capable of absorbing the brutal shock of open-sea rowing. You'll notice these boats completely lacked high masts. By keeping the profile low, the builders created a craft with a very low center of gravity and a distinctly shallow draft, meaning the bottom of the boat barely sat below the waterline. To maintain a straight heading without a compass, navigators used celestial gating. During the day, they tracked the sun's arc using a sunstone, a polarizing crystal that locates the sun even through heavy cloud cover. At night, they locked their heading onto the steer star, or North Star, to maintain a fixed point of reference. Approaching Britain, they tapped into a biological radar system known as avian tracking. By observing the specific flight paths of migratory birds, the crews received early warning signals that land was approaching, long before it broke the horizon. But the most sophisticated technique was swell reading. As deep water waves crash into the rising, underwater continental shelf of Britain, they create physical backwash ripples that bounce back out to sea. Highly experienced steersmen could feel this specific wave feedback hitting the hull of their small boats. They were reading the underwater topography of the British coast through the soles of their feet. These sailors didn't survive the deep sea by relying on complex mechanical instruments. They survived by synchronizing themselves entirely with the environmental data around them. When the fleets finally reached eastern Britain, they immediately faced a human threat. The coastlines were still dotted with heavy Roman military forts. Tracing their naval trajectory, the fleets targeted the Humber estuary over open water ports. An estuary is where freshwater rivers meet the ocean. By entering these waterways and branching inward, the ships bypassed the fortified coast. This is where that shallow draft, clinker-built design became critical. Because the hulls sat so high in the water, the crews could seamlessly transition from surviving massive ocean swells to navigating narrow, shallow river systems without needing to switch boats. The fleets rode directly upstream. They moved away from the flat, marshy coastlines of the east, pushing deep into the country until they reached the steep, workable banks of the northwest. By treating the river systems as a hidden highway, the migrants turned what appeared to be an impenetrable island fortress into an accessible open door. The fleets finally drove their hulls into the mud and beached in the regions of the Mersey and the Ribble rivers. They had reached the solid ground of the Lancashire and Staffordshire borders. After hundreds of miles of rowing, the physical migration was over, but surviving the journey required an immediate, total shift in their way of life. The crews had to instantly transition from ocean navigators back to inland farmers to prepare for the coming winter. With no sawmills or existing infrastructure waiting for them, they turned to the ultimate act of resourcefulness. They began dismantling the very ships that had carried them across the North Sea to harvest the raw timber. The curved oak ribs of the shallow draft hulls were pulled apart, inverted, and planted directly into the earth. These maritime components became the load-bearing arched roofs of their very first tuns, or farmsteads. The exact technology designed to ride above the rising ocean was physically planted into the soil of Britain. It formed the foundational roots of the Tunnicliffe lineage, giving them a permanent anchor that the tide could never steal.